All right, it's good. Thank you. Thanks, Anne, so much. And thanks to all of you for coming back to be in person here. Thanks to all the far flung friends on Zoom. I'm glad you're joining us. So, welcome back for more food stories. Remember that there will, this is part of a larger series that we have. Come back to this. There we go. So we will, today I'll talk a little bit about food tying into social status and social competition. There will not be a lecture here next week because of the Friday, the Easter Passover weekend, but then two more lectures on food and religious identity, and then another on gifts and rituals. So I wanted to start with an anecdote that actually comes back to what started me on this project many, many years ago now. But one of the first examples that I came across that made me think that food was going to be an interesting kind of topic. And that was just a simple account that I came across of a government official in Venice who had been charged with slander because there was an enemy, there was another official that he'd had ongoing disputes with. And so they would occasionally insult each other in public. And at one point, this man, he encountered his enemy in public and saw him and said, "You eat alone at the table." And so the second person was able to accuse him of slander because that was such a dangerous and damaging thing to say. You eat alone at the table. Like, of all the things we could insult each other with. But that was something that the first person could be accused of slander for, because it was such a dangerous, insulting, damaging thing to say. It implies you have no connections, no one trusts you. You don't have any sort of public legitimacy. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Who you eat with as part of a public presentation of who you are. There's food being used in interesting ways. So that was the first thing that I came across that made me think of food as much more than food, right? Food is symbol, food is connection, food that gives us a lot of stories about people. So keep in mind the context that I described last time. Europe is very much a society of orders, and with distinct categories of people where everyone has a very clearly determined role that is shaped by gender, age, status, religion, region, but it matters very much the sort of category that you fit into. And there's a whole set of behaviors and appearances and expectations that have to line up with that have to be performed in a particular way. And so this means there's a kind of choreography to everyday life that I think is much more complex than what we're accustomed to. And it's important for that kind of choreography to be visible, who you associate with, how you present yourself, how you dress yourself, who you eat with. So that leads me to think of all of these social relationships as kinds of performances. And this is especially true in contexts like Spanish cities like Seville and Madrid. These are relatively new cities. And it also, what matters here is the urban context as well, the society of orders, the kinds of legal definitions that shape people are really based on a medieval rural kind of context where land matters. And the power and authority are defined by land, who owns it, who manages it, the peasants that work on it. Cities are a whole different context. Cities create new possibilities for people that don't really have a clearly defined social place. So cities like Seville and Madrid are especially so because they're fairly new. Madrid is only established as the Spanish court in 1561. It's a fairly small village before that. So tens of thousands of people are coming into the court. The same thing with Seville. Seville's population doubles with trade, with fleets going to the Indies between 1500 and 1580. The population doubled. They get tens of thousands of people that are coming into this new context and looking for ways to establish themselves. They're not traditional elites. They're not traditional families. So they're looking for ways to perform new kinds of social identity. So in many ways, you have sort of two measures of status, title and wealth. Traditionally, those had always gone together. Noble families, again, power measured in terms of land and heritage. Wealth went along with that. So for medieval nobility, wealth is measured much more in terms of land and the management of land. But then with the Renaissance, they come to be separate. It is possible to pursue wealth, to gain wealth, without having had this traditional heritage. So we have new kinds of people, people who aren't people like this a merchant, someone who is not of noble lineage, but who can accumulate wealth through trade or banking or scholarship or government positions. through their activities, through the kinds of things they do. So these are people who don't fit into the traditional categories, but they gain wealth, and they want to position themselves among the old elites as much as they can. They want to perform in the same kinds of ways. This is the same thing that happens with artists like Murillo and Velázquez, who do not come from noble families. But like the merchants and bankers, they're carving out new territories based on what they do, based on their ability, based on what they can offer. So both of them want to, they fit into these new groups of people. They want to establish themselves. Murillo's father was a barber surgeon. Velázquez was the son of a notary. So these are not people from traditional, again, from noble titled families. Both of them clearly make names for themselves. Both of them make spectacular careers. They're from Seville and Madrid. But both of them also have to rely on powerful patrons to access the kinds of things they want. And the famous representation of Velázquez, the self-portrait that he includes in Las Meninas with the cross of the Order of Santiago, that is something he doesn't actually qualify for. It's one of the oldest traditional military religious orders for nobility. And to apply, one has to present a full genealogy documenting one's background for at least 3 generations back. Velázquez does not have a noble enough lineage to qualify, so he's rejected. And the only way he is eventually accepted into this group is from the intervention of King Philip IV, who asks actually for a papal dispensation. So rules have to be broken to allow this to happen. But because of his artistic ability, because of his contributions to the court, Velázquez is able to do that. And similarly, Murillo, the brotherhood that he wants to join in Seville, he doesn't qualify for, but he has the support of the president of the organization, possibly the patron who has commissioned the Prodigal Son cycle. So it's possible for these new people to introduce themselves into elite circles by virtue of their connections and what they can accomplish. So the best mechanisms, if you have larger groups of people who are doing this, artists, bankers, merchants, tradesmen, it's part of this kind of social performance. You can commission art, or you can create art, or you can dress in a certain way. People invest a great deal in clothing and appearance, or you can set your table in a certain way. The people that you eat with, the food is one of these mechanisms for creating a kind of social image for yourself. So I think in this sense, the table is kind of a stage. As a way of presenting, as a way of carving out an identity for these people who are trying to find a place in a society that doesn't have a very traditional place for them. So eating, in cases like this, eating is often a very social occasion, more than just your ordinary lunch at home, especially for men of a certain status who would dine out with other people and, again, seeking to make these kinds of connections and presentations. So there's some evidence the way people write about these social meals. People don't keep diaries in the way that we think of them as personal reflections on our lives. That doesn't really happen until the 19th century. But Renaissance merchant families do keep record books that are kind of an interesting mix, that are personal comments. They would note maybe weddings, family connections, gatherings, festivals, also major sales and transactions. They're all together. In these fairly short, not very elaborate, but just brief accounts of things that happened each day. But they always record meals. Who did I eat with? Where did I eat? What did I eat? But they registered those kinds of connections as important interactions that are worth keeping track of. Dining with other people always gets written down, as does where you sit. The position that you have at the table is part of this social performance. So you might, we still think of this, right? That you would seat someone at the head of the table, wherever your table, whatever shape it might be. You think there's a privileged spot, right? You would allow someone to sit at the head of a table. Or you might be familiar with the phrase above the salt that comes from long medieval tables where you would have a salt cellar placed about halfway through. Anyone who is above the salt is of a higher status. So you organize people around a table based on where they fit in that particular grouping. In Spain, at most formal dinners, you would actually have a separate table, as there is in this illustration. There would always be a first table. So not just someone being at the head of a table, but a separate table entirely for the most honored and privileged guests. And that's the kind of thing when people write about public meals, they describe who was at the first table. That's something people notice, and it's registered, it's remembered. So one of the examples I came across, a merchant in Zamora, his name is Antonio Moreno. He keeps one of these record books of just his interactions with people, his economic transactions. And he mentions on a feast day in 1675, his entry for that day reads, there was a sermon from the famous Franciscan, and then a fulsome meal, especially at the first table with the dean, the priests, the aldermen, and myself. So that it's a compliment. He was sitting at the first table. That's a visible representation of me. He was with the highest authorities of the town, and that's a particular point of pride for him. So if you're setting up a banquet that's large, that's not a hard thing to organize, that you can have a separate table. But the first table thing matters enough that people will go to surprising lengths to make sure there is one, even when it's difficult, even if there are challenges of space or organization. Another example is an Italian cardinal, Francesco Barberini. This is actually the same cardinal that participates in the trial of Galileo, although he supports Galileo. But he travels for several months in 1625 through Spain. So he's a well-established cardinal, a man of great prestige. He has a small retinue of people that travel with him. And so they're going from place to place. They often stay in small towns. They often eat at small inns, not grand lodgings. When they're formally recognized by noble families, they eat very well. But in many cases, they're traveling. They'll stop overnight. They're not expecting fancy meals. In fact, often they'll arrive somewhere without much notice, and they might have a dinner of fried eggs. They don't mind. They understand that they're in those kinds of circumstances, but there has to be a first table. There might not be much food. They might have leftover bread for the night, but there has to be. There's one night where they are actually being hosted by local elites, but their host has provided only one table, and this is an outrage. There are pages of one of his secretaries writes extensively about these travels, and they're so upset that there isn't a separate table that they negotiate for some time. How can we? Because we have the cardinal and his associates and the servants, and they can't be at the same table, even if it's late at night and they're not eating a very fancy meal. But they finally arrange to have very distinct plates, that they're silver plates for the cardinal and his highest associates, and just napkins. And then there's a little bit of distance between them. So they managed to set up kind of like the illusion of a separate table. But it's important enough that the message that it sends is important enough to maintain that they're very concerned about that visible difference in where people sit. So mostly these negotiations happen with elites. It matters to people who have the most prestige. A cardinal would be very concerned about maintaining his place at the first table. But it happens with everyone. Anytime you have any kind of social group, and any collection of people, as they eat together, they're going to be organized by status. So, for example, students at a university will be that the senior students would be at the first table, or the rectors, the professors would be at the first table, and then they're organized by rank after that. In monasteries, you would have the abbot or the prelates at the first table. In any kind of organization, the most prestigious people are at the first table, and then according to seniority, rank, status, they're organized after that. So any kind of grouping of people, when they eat together, they're carefully organized by seating to make sure that everyone's social position is visible and reinforced. You can look at the room and map out who everyone is based on where they're seating. And similarly, for any collective group like this, students, monasteries, for those who commit some infraction of the rules, if you were to be punished in some way, of course, you eat alone. Now you're separated from the rest. So everyone's high school cafeteria nightmare. Right? You're separated. You're made to sit aside. So these are often built into the rules, the regulations of collective life. That the punishment for most minor infractions is eating alone for a number of days or perhaps weeks. So it's all built into this sort of public display of status and position. So another way of performing status, and one that's a little bit more malleable, a little bit more under your control, is, of course, ingredients and table settings, what things you choose for a meal, how you present them. And this is where the element of competition comes in a little bit more, that people with more wealth, people with more money can leverage that a little bit. Even if they're from newer families, they don't have the kind of heritage that would ordinarily lift them up, but they can buy things. So newer kinds of seasonings, more fancy table settings, those become more prominent. So we see a variety of, especially seasonings. This is an area where people can compete. In the 1500s, Europeans have established trade connections as far as through the Indian Ocean into Indonesia, and they had access to things like cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg, pepper, vanilla, these new kinds of things that you can bring to your table, which shows again that you have wealth, that you have connections, that you have the sophistication to choose these things. And they've all become fairly common to us now, to the degree that someone noted the other day. It's ironic that we describe plain things now as being vanilla. Like that's plain vanilla, right? Something that doesn't interesting. Vanilla used to be the most rare and exotic of the flavors. Vanilla was amazing. And now we use it as like that's just plain vanilla. But vanilla was one of these things that was fairly new. It was exotic. It was expensive. It was hard to maintain. So that becomes one of these things that elites can, or the new elites and aspiring elites, can try to get access to dress up their tables. So two of the most significant products in this sense are sugar, as I mentioned last time, and chocolate. So sugar has been known to Europeans. They mostly sweeten things with honey. So there are sweet flavors, but for the medieval period, they generally use honey. There is sugar available in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's rare, it's difficult to acquire, but all the more coveted because of that. But when the Portuguese begin to cultivate sugar in Brazil in the early mid-1500s, then there's kind of an explosion that sugar in large amounts is available for import. And everybody, but it's still a symbol of wealth and influence because it has been perceived as rare for so long. There's an explosion of sugar in everything. All of the court recipes, and it begins in the court, right? Because it's perceived as rare and valuable and of high status. So the late 1500s, sugar appears in all of the recipes at court and gets mixed with everything, not just desserts, but savory dishes, meat dishes, eggplant casserole with sugar. Roast beef with a sugar sauce. It's a little horrifying, but it goes in everything. One of the favorite dishes of King Philip of Spain was a thing called manjar blanco. So the origin of blancmange, the sweet pudding, except that the Spanish version is based on chicken. It's a main dish. So you take chicken, of course, is an appropriately elite food with wings. But you take chicken breast and boil it and shred it finely and pound it into kind of a paste that you then mix with rice flour and almond milk and significant quantities of sugar and just sort of a paste. And then you eat that, you cool it and eat it as sort of a sweet pudding. I did not bring samples, but I have not had the nerve to quite try it. I need to test this at some point, but that's one of the favorite foods at the royal palace, one of Philip II's favorite things. And again, it shows up in all of the court recipe books. It's sort of an example of all the fine elite things pulled together. Chicken and almond and rice and sugar are together as this pudding. And like many of these things, it starts in elite circles. It starts at the court and then kind of works its way down. It's royal food, and then people gradually get more access to it as the sugar becomes more affordable. It ends up within a few decades, you see it registered in street markets. You can buy a bowl on the street, so it's accessible to ordinary people. Or my other favorite is this. Again, this is from Arte de Cocina, but Martínez Montiño is the chef at the palace. So this is the sort of royal collection of recipes, and it is stuffed onions, which you would prepare seasoned with spices and cinnamon, add a bit of sugar, and when they're done, you make a sweet sauce of sugar and cinnamon. And egg yolks, and set the onions in the sauce. Again, no samples. Don't try this at home, or do try it at home if you dare. But yeah, onions are not the highest status of food, but anything can be sort of ennobled by the addition of, and again, this is a royal recipe, so it's something that was prepared at court. Stuffed onions with cinnamon and sugar. It goes with everything. But because it carries the kind of suggestion of status and wealth. So sugar very quickly works its way in to the European table, as does chocolate. Much more appealing, I think, than the stuffed onions. Chocolate is much more appealing. One of the few products, actually, that is very quickly adopted from the Americas. It's curious that Spaniards are very invested in the spices that were known. Pepper from Africa, other spices, vanilla and cloves and things from Indonesia. Products from the Americas, they don't incorporate as quickly, partly probably because they're not already invested with status. They're not familiar things Things like in corn and potatoes and tomatoes, these products that we know come from the Americas that become significant parts of European cuisine, but not for a couple of centuries, and never really as elite foods. Corn is fed to animals for decades before people try to eat it. So those products are adopted, but very slowly and very reluctantly. Chocolate catches on. Chocolate works much better, probably because it is recognized by Aztec nobles as a kind of ritual offering to prestigious people. So it fits into that vocabulary of elite things that you offer to favorite guests. So it's quickly adopted, first in Spain, and then gradually works its way into the rest of Europe. And it doesn't bear much resemblance to the Hershey bar, sort of version of chocolate you might think of. It's prepared more like coffee, that you would grind and roast cocoa beans, and they're very bitter, spice them with cinnamon or anise or cloves. Europeans will then, of course, combine this with sugar, but it becomes a very kind of ritualized thing to offer to guests. So it does kind of fit into that elite framework. In fact, there's a lovely description from a French baroness who is traveling in Spain, and she's welcomed into the household of a Spanish duchess. And she describes, as part of this encounter, they present you with chocolate, everyone a china cupful, upon a little dish of agate set in gold, with sugar in a box of the same. So there's a whole presentation that goes along with this. And then various kinds of porcelain and silver chocolate sets that become important for elite families. In fact, also considered to have kind of medicinal properties. Our friend Charles II, the King of Spain in the late 17th century, whose portrait is upstairs. Not a very strong constitution, not a very physically robust sort of person, but his doctors prescribed him to take chocolate every morning as a good solution to that. So I would like to know who his doctors are. But he is recommended to have regular doses of chocolate. And just like sugar, initially it's introduced into the courts. It's the province of elites, but it does not take very long to spread. The first license to make and sell chocolate was granted in Madrid in 1634. And just by the end of that century, within a few decades, there are municipal regulations note that chocolate has introduced itself in such a way there is hardly a shop on the streets where it isn't sold. So it starts in the courts, but gradually it becomes more accessible. In fact, to the extent that there are very quickly complaints of places that are mixing it with sawdust and trying to stretch it out a little bit and selling less than perfect kinds of chocolate. But it becomes fairly accessible fairly quickly. So all of these things that carry that message of being elite and being exclusive don't stay that way very long, precisely because people are using them to try to gain status, trying to get access to them as quickly as they can. So another element of ways people can leverage this, if you're one of these sort of new elites trying to carve out a social space, you can work with your connections and sit at the first table, or you can acquire chocolate and serve it to your guests, or you can have fine table settings. And this is fairly new. In fact, if you notice things like the table set for the prodigal son, the food is very fine food, but there aren't individual plates. There isn't really cutlery. There's one knife. There's one glass. There isn't really an elaborate table setting. That's fairly common. In fact, for most of even these sort of banquet scenes, you don't see individual table settings. They're not commonly used yet. Late medieval, early Renaissance people, they'll have these extraordinary banquets with the several courses of food, but there tend to be common large platters that at most you would eat with your hands. You might have a plate, a chunk of bread that you would use as kind of a plate. But the individual table setting evolves just a little bit later, but that becomes the kind of thing that you can acquire then to show that you have more taste and sophistication. So Renaissance eating, again, tends to be out of these common serving bowls, possibly with your hands. Forks appear with the Italian Renaissance. Italians give us forks. And they start showing up in household inventories for the first time really in the 1500s. In the Italian courts, and then again they gradually spread fairly slowly. Spoons and individual glasses, even you would have a common glass to pass around. So those kind of individual serving things become common by the late 1500s, so well into the Renaissance. So acquiring these items becomes fairly quickly a high priority. There's documentation, this is from the Gonzaga household in Mantua, a fresco of the Banquet of Cupid and Psyche, but you can see the kinds of credenza here that would be typical of an elite Renaissance noble household to showcase the family silver, the family plates, usually with a crest or an emblem of some kind indicating the family. This is a typical kind of credenza that would become part of household architecture, of household decoration. So you start seeing in household inventories, for example, this family has, even in the early 1500s, they're cutting edge with this. Their plate inventory is 359 silver pieces, things like fruit cups, fruit dishes, drinking cups, candlesticks, soft boats, for a total collection of about 500 pounds of silver. So it's both the display of wealth and the sophistication of having individual plates, and in the beginning, the introduction of a few kinds of cutlery. So there's more research actually done on this for Italy than there is for Spain. But I expect as historians do more work with these kinds of household inventories, we'll find the same thing. That, again, elite families lead the way with the large collections of fine silver and porcelain. But fairly ordinary people pick it up quickly. Ordinary tradesmen, craftsmen, tailors, small-scale merchants. When they start to acquire, if they get some extra money, if they start acquiring luxury goods, it's always luxury goods related to food and clothing. Clothing is the two areas where they can effectively spend money on to improve their image, to raise their status, are clothing and food. So household inventories, again, even a fairly, what we would now call middle class, kind of ordinary craftsmen, working people, would have large tables. There's a tailor in Siena who has a dining table and seats for 14 in his reception room, 14 serving bowls, 18 metal plates, 24 wine glasses, 1 fork. Just starting to, because first were mostly more used for serving than individual place sittings, but he's got one. Or similarly, a merchant in Segovia has a large walnut dining table, 24 chairs, dozens of knives, 13 spoons, 3 forks. He's ahead. So again, these could be stamped or engraved with a family emblem, or if a family, these are not families that would be likely to have coats of arms, but if they did, they would mark these on their possessions. So if you're investing money in things, they're going to choose table settings. They're going to choose fine ingredients. They're going to choose things that will let them project this kind of air of not genuine nobility, but an air of eliteness. So people with money can do this. Traditional elites are not going to be thrilled, right? Their space is being moved into by these people who can do kind of extraordinary displays of things. So the element of display, this is where you get, again, the sort of degrees of competition. These are all sculptures of sugar. And so the advantage of sugar is that it's sweet and you can mix it with things, but you can also make it into a paste. So you get these elaborate tablescapes of sculptures and creatures that are made from sugar. This is possible for people with money. So that you get into this sort of competition: who can have the fanciest table, who can have the fanciest kinds of settings. And traditional elites will want to defend themselves. How do you fight back? If the competition is over money and expense, traditional nobles don't have that kind of leverage as much as they used to. So the response to this is actually greater restraint. For nobles who are kind of leading the way in terms of setting cultural standards, this is gauche, this is new riches, this is the excessive, extravagant, gluttonous things that these common people are doing. Real nobility is about restraint and taste and fewer dishes, but things that are well chosen, sophistication more than excess. So there's kind of a shift in culture as a response to this, as a response to new elites spending their money, to traditional elites suggesting that no, that's gauche. That the real status comes from inherited taste and sophistication and knowing how to do things. And that will actually go along. Oh, sorry, that's going ahead in the manners. That will go along with some legal restrictions, the kind of concerns that I mentioned last week about excess spending. It comes out of this sense of competition, that people are trying to compete to establish themselves as having the best table and the best connections. So that leads to genuine economic and moral concern about wasteful spending and extravagance and gluttony and immorality. So there's sort of an economic concern, but also the concern of traditional nobles wanting to defend themselves. Both of those get expressed in sumptuary laws that simply put limits. You can't spend this much on traditional banquets or on funeral banquets or on wedding banquets. So in for example, the 1560s, there are cases, where are my examples? The Cortes in Madrid describe the notorious excess and disorder caused by dinners and banquets. And so they mark out some limitations. Only 2 kinds of fruit at the beginning and the end of a meal. You can only have 4 different dishes. The Barcelona City Council limits weddings to only 20 guests on both sides. No poultry or game birds within a week either side of the wedding. So clearly they're finding ways it's not just the wedding, but a week. You can't just happen to have a banquet the next day. So they start to have restrictions on the kinds of things that can be served, the number of guests, trying to cut down on that sort of extraordinary spending that the new wealthy families are actually managing to use. So if you can't serve as much, and you can't have this excessive number of guests or the huge banquets, then you shift the emphasis into doing it well, doing it with greater, again, taste, sophistication, presentation, choosing things carefully. So with that, you have the origins of the first real attention to table manners. Not just the selection of things, but how gracefully do you eat? As you're getting all of these sort of elaborate table settings, the plates and forks, how do you use them? Delicate crystal glasses, do you have the grace to drink gracefully out of a delicate glass? So there's it's a sort of shifting the competition over status into a different arena. It's not just the expense, but it's the behavior that goes along with that. How do you eat gracefully? So if you have these sort of common serving bowls, no individual plates, people generally eating with their hands, we have kind of a different starting point for developing table manners. In fact, in the court of Alfonso X of Castile, this is 13th century, it was described actually in a law code that taking food with all 5 fingers is rude, but if you eat with 3, that's gracious. That's elegant. In fact, the king was known for having particular style in how he ate with his hands. So eating with your hands is a normal, acceptable thing. There's still kind of gracious ways to do it. So you start to get descriptions of how best to do that, how to introduce the fork. When does it cease to be acceptable to eat with your hands? But as late as 1530, we have actually Erasmus, who writes one of the early sort of conduct books, and he mentions this, that in good society, one does not put both hands into the dish. It's more refined to use only 3 fingers. So again, there are very, very rudimentary kinds of table manners. But he goes on to note, this is one of the distinctions between the upper and lower classes. There's this immediate association with status, that you present yourself as a certain kind of person based on how you eat. You don't dive your hands into the dish like wolves. Children shouldn't gnaw bones like dogs do. And then other kinds of things. It's unseemly to blow your nose in the tablecloth. These are fun to read. There are lots, and these are not at all unusual. So the German conduct book that suggests don't blow your nose with the same hand that you use to hold the meat, which again suggests you're holding the meat with your hands. And it goes on to explain that one blows one's nose into one's left hand, and then one handles one's food with one's right. So there are appropriate ways to do these things. And then my favorite, I think, is the last one, the Austrian orders. This is for officers. This is for the people who are already sort of higher ranking. It's not for enlisted men. It's for guidance for officers. If you're eating at the Archduke's table, wipe your mustache before drinking from a common glass, so we still have a common glass that's passed around. Do not lick the fingers. Do not spit in the plate. And all of these remind you, do not wipe. It must have been a common thing, because you're constantly reminded, please don't wipe your nose on the tablecloth. Someone must have been doing this. So yeah, these are the earliest kinds of descriptions of how to behave yourself properly at the table. And they reflect a broader development of really all of them are kind of about self-control, about not grabbing food, restraining yourself in various kinds of ways. The sociologist Norbert Elias calls this the civilizing process, the ways in which you kind of discipline yourself. And it includes mostly the examples are food related, but also not urinating in public, other kinds of not scratching yourself, the things that we teach people in kindergarten. Right, we've adopted these things. We've kind of built them into the expectations of modern life, but this is where they start. as a way of kind of social performance, and especially as ways around food. So all of them are things, again, that we kind of incorporate into the education of young children. Don't pick your nose, keep your hands to yourself, don't chew with your mouth open, all these kinds of basic monitoring of yourself. But here they're all associated with phrases about status. Don't belch at the meal because only drunks do that. All of the descriptions are things like Erasmus says, the child should not gnaw bones as dogs do. You're distinguishing yourself from the animals. And most of these have that kind of opposition. Don't do this because that's what animals do. Don't jump into your food because that's what wolves do. So your men distinguish themselves from beasts by the ways that they behave themselves at table. So even though we've fortunately sort of internalized these things, they're beginning here as part of this emphasis on restraint, that you demonstrate your superiority, not just between humans and animals, but then your superiority in the ranks of humans by the kind of restraint and proper behavior that you exhibit, cleanliness, and not wiping your mustache before drinking from a common glass. Those kinds of things that make you more presentable, really, to other people. So that the restraint is part of this. The restraint of appetite, restraint of sharing things. You shouldn't take the first piece of something. You shouldn't take the last piece of something. And many of these still, I mean, we've incorporated lots of these into kind of common behavior now. But it's one of my favorite examples that you still see in Spain is that it's very common at any meal or any gathering to have a dish of olives, right? That you would share before a meal or over a drink. You're gathering with people, olives are going to be there. So people share a bowl of olives. You don't take the last one. The social rule is that no one ever, because you should, like, if I do, then you don't get it. So that the polite thing to do is to leave it for someone else, except that if everyone does that, no one, so there's, and this is common enough that it has a name. It's the olive, la vergüenza, that's the shame, the olive of shame, because you're not to take it. It's shameful to take it and not give it. So it's that kind of restraint of leaving something for someone else, but it's still built into these customs that we see today. So all of these are expectations that are defined as the appropriate public behavior in the Renaissance. And like everything else, there's that sort of trickle-down effect, that these kinds of descriptions start in the courts. In the royal courts, Erasmus is writing mostly for the children of princes. So these behaviors begin at court tables, at royal tables, and then are kind of leveraged again by other people looking to establish themselves, looking to be able to behave appropriately in kinds of court situations. And they always come along with these associations with status. Don't tip your chair back because that is only done among people who are not worthy of respect. All of these things establish you in a certain rank. So we have written examples of these. So the next step, the first is that these are sort of taught in or adopted in court circles, but then they get written down, and they're hugely popular. So there are these examples. There are dozens of these. The most famous of them are Castiglione and Erasmus and de la Casa. But there are dozens and dozens of what are called conduct books, behavior manuals, because these are things that can be codified. If there's a set of rules, you can write it down, you can publish it, you can buy it, you can read it, and they get adopted more broadly. So everything that becomes or that begins as the province of elites, here are things that nobles do to distinguish themselves, they can all get copied. They can all get copied by people with wealth. Now they can all get copied by people who read. So there are all sorts of, it goes along with the assumption that appropriate behavior is learned. It's possible to distinguish yourself from wolves by reading about how to eat properly and then practicing it. So these instructions become, these are printed, published, they become widely popular. And sort of consumed by a fairly broad audience that, again, is trying to carve out kind of a social space for itself. So think where we've ended up with this. We've adopted the customs of table manners fairly broadly, but in terms of things like fancy table settings, right? You've all had elegant meals with a nice table layout that looks like this. It's not entirely necessary. Right? It's nice to have the several forks for different things. You don't really need several forks. It's much more about the knowledge, about knowing how to navigate a table setting like this. And I'm not sure about SMU, but certainly at TCU, especially at the business school, there are courses and workshops that will lead students through this, how to behave appropriately, how to handle, how to navigate a table setting like this, what's proper etiquette. Because we're not born knowing these things. They're all invented rules. So if you want to move up into certain social levels, you need to know how to behave. You need to know which fork to use for the right course. And this is what, a couple of decades ago now, but the movie Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts, there's the scene where she has to eat at the Fan's Inn, an elegant hotel, and the hotel manager has to sit her down beforehand, like, explain, here's how you do this, here's what the different things are for, you have to act like you know these things. That's entry into polite society. But the secret is, certainly in this context, if you have published conduct books, anybody can learn the rules. They begin as the province of elites, as distinguishing people at the finest tables, but if Julia Roberts can learn, so can we all. So the individual table settings, the basic table manners at court start among nobles, but fairly quickly become the province of pretty, not universally, but certainly down the social scale. So this is kind of the overall pattern that we have with these kinds of food behaviors. There's competition for status and recognition and creating kind of a public image. New families with wealth will imitate traditional nobles by doing and eating the same kinds of things. The first stages are providing quantities of food, the enormous banquets, just the sheer amounts of things. And then it's getting access to special kinds of foods, sugar and different kinds of spices and seasonings. Then it's having a finely set table. Then it's developing table manners to behave appropriately and eating politely. And all of these become sort of more widespread, more accessible, more ordinary, kind of a slow democratizing of the table. So it's chocolate for kings and eventually chocolate for us all. So I'll pause with that. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions and have the microphone.
Yeah, so just a reminder for those of us in the auditorium, we will need to use the microphone when asking questions so that everyone on Zoom can hear. And I'd actually like to start with a question that comes from Zoom.
Sure.
So from your modern perspective, what is the most surprising or strangest things you found when working on this topic?
Oh gosh, so many. I think the sugar onions rank pretty high. Just into like the sugar and cinnamon as an ingredient in everything. That and the not blowing your nose in the tablecloth. That was fun. Probably the recipes, the things, again, the sugar and cinnamon, that seems to be much more about that kind of performative element than it is about something tasting good. And again, to be fair, I have not tried the chicken sugar dish, so it might be better than I'm expecting. But I have doubts. So I think those are the table manners.
Thank you.
Were there any patterns with regard to the presence of animals around the table?
Oh, that's a great question. There are always dogs in the paintings, always. I have not come across any written references, like in the descriptions of meals, like in terms of sort of an acceptably, it's not okay to have animals present. That they never say that. So I expect that they would be, and they're always present in the images. Always, mostly dogs, occasionally cats. So I don't think that was considered inappropriate. They're probably part of the household. And
in terms of the prodigal son, the aphorism about not gnawing a bone like a dog does is an absolutely perfectly illustrated fact. And I think that, and the use of the lute, which was associated with sexuality, were very intentional by Murillo. The other thing is that first slide that you showed, the intemperate and the temperate.
yes.
Is that how do you know where that title comes from, first of all? And second of all, I would say that apparently we may talk about ladder climbing, but in those days they probably spoke about table climbing.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Table climbing. The origin, I use this partly because I love the image. And it has the separate table, but it's also the temperate, those who are restrained, the elites that are at the higher table that are moderate in their behavior and restrained, whereas the folks at the lower table are much more rambunctious. And so I think it's illustrating that the greater control, but also that sort of goes along with the more limited enjoyment, and then the lower group that is more uncontrolled and unrestrained and unlicensed. So it's just illustrating those oppositions.
Of course, to us moderns, they look like they're having more fun too.
Exactly. That's what I see. But that's part of the idea, right? The restraint does tend to sort of limit the enjoyment of the activity.
Yes, ma'am. In your research, have you found information regarding mincemeat?
Oh, probably. I don't remember. Do you ask for a particular reason? Does it have a significance?
I asked for a particular reason in as much as when I was young, folks had mincemeat pie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And I served that one Christmas. Nobody would touch it.
Oh.
Of course, it has no meat in it presently. But I Googled the thing and found that the origin of that was in the days when meat was less fresh.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And so these were amendments that were added to the meat to make it edible, and through the years, it's just become, a specialty, and minced meat raisin pie is what it really is.
There's actually, that's been an interesting development, is that the whole European obsession with spices used to be explained that way, that meat wasn't very well preserved and therefore would be likely to go rancid, and so you would season it strongly, especially with pepper, to cover that. Right. That isn't as accepted as it used to be, because meat probably would have been dangerous to have it go bad so often. So that the theory now is much more that they like the spices. It's an intentional choice. It's not covering up a poor cut of meat. It's for the spices themselves.
This may have predated your research.
It may be more in Northern European. And there are similar kinds of pies that you'd find in Spain, but not as. I suspect it's more of an English.
So then your research has been more to the
more Mediterranean. Yeah.
Pardon me?
More Mediterranean.
Yeah,
Spain
more
and Italy.
Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And this
I
has
expect
been in Northern Europe.
Yeah, I expect they were very similar. That's the kind of thing that would go back.
Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
I have one question from Zoom, and then I'll get to you. So someone is wondering if you know of any compilations of some of these court recipes that people can purchase. Any cookbooks?
Yes. The conduct books all can. The recipe books. The one with this one. This might be available online. There are 2 or 3 of the principal ones. Martinez Montino is available, I think, as a published, not translated, but certainly transcribed. So that's accessible. So there are actually quite a few of them. So 2 or 3 of the Spanish ones, several English ones. There is a Facebook group called the Early Modern Recipes Project, I think. There are lots of people who work on kind of reclaiming these and making them accessible. So if you would like to experiment with this in your own home, there are lots of ways. And there's a wonderful recipe book that I will mention, I'll talk more about in 2 Fridays, that's a collection of Jewish recipes, because Spain was increasingly concerned with sort of maintaining this uniform Catholic presence with a substantial number of converted Jews and Muslims. And one of the most visible ways of determining if someone was maintaining secret Muslim or Jewish practices was how they prepared food. So Inquisition officials paid really close attention to people's kitchens. And that gives us a lot more historical information on what people were doing and the ingredients that they had and the dishes they had. So there is a recipe collection called A Drizzle of Honey that's based on Inquisition records. So that's an interesting one. So some of these are original recipe collections from their own time, but there are also these things that have been compiled by historians. So that's a teaser for next time. I'll have stories about that.
Yes, you mentioned status at the table and the positioning, and traditionally, I guess the master goes at the head of the table. Nonetheless, when you see large banquets, either in a painting or in actuality, I remember being at Hollywood Palace in Edinburgh, and the Queen sits along the long side of the table in the middle. And I think the explanation that was given is more conducive to conversation rather than at the end. Is that
I think
when did that change?
I'm not
curious.
sure. Because we have that phrase at the head of the table that we usually mean to signify the narrow end, but the descriptions don't specify that. And I think that might be more of a modern interpretation. So, because you do see in the images of banquets, and it might be just for the visual representation. So you can see the person facing you in the middle is the person that's the most prestigious. But it's always the host might be, the descriptions are usually the host needs to reserve the best place for the guest of privilege. So I think that could be at the middle. They don't usually specify a place, as long as there is a separate first table. Where one sits around that could vary. And actually, the sort of pride of place within that table is then indicated by tableware. That we get an extra plate for the bread, where everyone else would have a napkin for the bread, or some kind of visibly different place setting, a silver plate where everyone else gets porcelain. That's another way of creating that distinction. But I think you're right that you often in those visual images, you see them at the center of the long end rather than the narrow end.
The written menu kind of a thing, is that something that all the higher noble class had at each one of their tables? Like, here's what you're having to eat in the meal.
Ooh.
And that would be right there beside the plate. This is all the goodies you're expecting to get.
I don't see that probably until maybe the 19th century. That's a later, and that's something you would expect now, right? You go to an elegant meal and have, or a wedding reception, there'll be the printed menu.
Because we do have friends, like when we have special traditional meals, they'll have a menu of what's served with the meal. I'm just curious, did they have it back then? Like you said, not probably till the 19th century.
I think not. I have not seen. That's a great. You see them in descriptions of the meals afterwards. People would recount what was there, but it would not be something that was presented as part of the meal until later. So I'm not sure that I don't know exact moment when that shows up, but it's probably, I would guess, 19th century. I have not seen examples of it.
I'm just curious of internationally, notice very limited back then, but travelers from Italy or from England or France, did that influence the rise in status and how they do things?
They certainly borrowed ideas from each other. And there are really two, Italians lead the way. So when the Spanish court is trying to, or when anyone is trying to imitate anyone, they're imitating Italians. Italians lead the way. And then as far as table manners, the real protocols come from the court of Burgundy. That they were the first, the Dukes of Burgundy were the first to develop real formal table manners, and those are actually written down then and brought to the court in Madrid. So so in some ways they're borrowed, in some ways they clash. You certainly have people coming from visit, because there's so many marriages among the noble families that have to bring people from one court to another, and they would find themselves in a sort of unfamiliar situation. So sometimes these things are borrowed or adopted, and sometimes they're just viewed as strange. But I think you would see that in more the choices of foods than anything else. That because the Spaniards are not terribly adventurous in adopting new foods. So they will keep things like cheese, but they'll say, oh, now we have cheese from Mallorca, and we have to, there are certain kinds that are from farther away that are better. So there is that sense that because of those trade connections, if we bring things in from farther, if it's a little bit more valuable that way, even if it's not necessarily better, it's just it was harder to get a hold of for us, that's more value. So that there is that emphasis on the farther away something comes from, the better it is, just for difficulty of access. But you can kind of trace the movement of manners that way too, from particular courts, from some households to others.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you so much for another fantastic lecture.